Thanks, Nick. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank, of course, the Architectural League, the committee, for giving us this wonderful award. And thank Anne, Nick, and everyone else for joining us today. We were really excited about this year's theme being resource, given that our work has tended to move away from the architectural realm proper and started to move actually to landscape. And also with the change in the title from just young architects to young architects and designers, which opened up the field to affiliated practices like ours, which are dealing less and less with architecture these days. Even though I'm trained as an architect, should know how to run these things if I'm an architect. Even though I'm trained as an architect, my partner is also trained as a landscape architect. And our work over the last 5 years has generally moved more and more to just thinking purely about public landscapes rather than architecture specific. So we actually started out our portfolio submittal with a quote from Buckminster Fuller, which was, "Pollution is nothing but a resource that we're not harvesting." And although Bucky's talking, it seems Bucky seems to be a reoccurring theme this evening. Even though Bucky is dealing with environmental pollution proper, we take its meaning to be all that is overlooked or undervalued. So by expanding that meaning, we explore wastewater, subsurface materials, maintenance regimes, and remnant spaces as the material and the inspiration for our projects. And by putting these untapped resources on display, we create mechanisms for engagement in the making of public space. So to make display legible, we use 3 techniques: the surficial, the organizational, and the procedural. Each involves a distinct method of framing so as to draw attention to that which may otherwise remain unnoticed. Surface techniques are those that utilize pattern as a discernible, repetitive system. The pattern may be materially similar to its surrounding, but its configuration underscores the intention to stand out. Organizational techniques frame materially contrasting environments by placing them adjacent to each other. These distinctions are often made by harnessing natural cycles in diverse ways so as to render unseen temporal processes visible. Procedural techniques utilize various maintenance strategies. These underrated design tools can be employed to direct growth towards new configurations or maintain distinctions among contiguous environments. So obviously, none of our projects deal specifically with one of these techniques per se, but given that we were asked to talk 25 minutes, I'm only going to talk about 3 projects through the singular technique of the surficial as a best way to represent this theme this year of resource. But before I started talking about our work, I wanted to kind of touch on or kind of situate the relevancy of surface techniques. So we're starting to think about our work in a broader legacy and the ideas that have impacted our thinking over contemporary landscape and public space in the last 5 years. So in particular, the field has been shaped by 2 divergent landscape camps of the 70s. What has been termed either the ecological or the artistic. And that would be best represented, the ecological, by Ian McHarg, and the 70s practitioner, 70s, 80s practitioner, Peter Walker. Over the subsequent decades, this divide has been melded at times by various practices, but there's been obviously a great re-emphasis on sustainability in both architecture and landscape architecture over the last decade. And with this, there's a huge emphasis on what we could call the performative aspects of design. So in landscape architecture in particular, this has kind of led to a preoccupation with infrastructure. So with the rise of environmentalism, resource and land use obviously become paramount. But we believe that Ian McHarg's lessons have been readily absorbed into the field. For instance, it's now standard to begin a project by considering the ecological context within which it's situated, or its life cycles, or to understand its other material values. So, in light of the necessity of site research and this emphasis on the performative, there have been many critics that have considered Walker's approach too contrived and too prescriptive. These critics consider, any use of pattern in landscape to be basically a predetermined, predefined desire that's just applied to the site, rather than the principles deriving through kind of keen analytic study, which we get through the McHargian model. And, this could be, or this was what Garrett Ekbo criticized landscape for being landscapes for viewing rather than landscapes for living. But given our interest in techniques for putting undervalued resources on display, we've been interested in how to return to some of the themes and techniques of pattern, seriality, and gesture investigated by Walker decades earlier. The effect for us is re-emphasizing the surface to bring about or return to Walker's interest for, quote, making landscapes visible, unquote. So the question for us is how then to make pattern operational or performative in both visual and environmental terms. How to combine Walker's surface techniques with McHarg's subsurface functions. So now that I've taken a chance to kind of frame the background of interest in the project, I'm going to use the surficial as a way to talk about 3 projects. The first project is the Mies Rohe Plaza, which was a competition we won with our friends PLY Architecture. In this project, we're interested in how pattern and fabrication can render an invisible material like water visible on the surface. The site is actually adjacent to Mies' seminal Lafayette Park project. You can see here, it sits basically, this photograph is taken from the tower of one of Mies' projects, and it basically sits on access to that tower, set between 2 commercial buildings. Although those commercial buildings were part of the original master plan by Hilbersheimer, they weren't actually designed by Mies Rohe, but they were designed in the spirit of Mies. I'm not really sure what the spirit of Mies is. I guess that's just being really derivative and ripping someone off. But the brief for the commemoration or the competition asked for this commemoration to Mies, and essentially what they were looking for was a gigantic bust of Mies' head at the end of that plaza. We weren't actually very interested in doing a gigantic bust of Mies' head. So instead, we decided to take 3 common Miesian devices, the grid, the plinth, and his book matching technique. But rather than just repeating some kind of language derived from the 50s, the 60s, we decided to introduce a degree of distortion. And so we distorted the grid, the plinth, and the book match. The grid was distorted in plan. The plinth was distorted in section, and then the book matching is distorted in profile. So this gave us a means to bring a degree of variation into the repetitive pattern. by tilting the plaza or giving some distortion in section, it also gave us the ability to put seating at the end, as you can see on the slide, and drainage to move from the front of the surface to the back of the surface. But it also, when we started to think about the plinth, how we could go beyond the overall distortion in section across the plinth, but also through the plinth. Typically in a Miesian plinth, it's flat, and all of the slope happens in the area unseen beneath. So we thought we could basically collapse that subsurface with the top surface as to render that drainage pattern visible as a dynamic surface rather than two separate surfaces. So this gave us the ability to start to celebrate the water and use the water in both a visual way and obviously a performative way, rather than just merely discarding it as a waste. The plinth itself we divided into a 4-foot grid. It's made up of a series of custom precast tiles, which we developed the tool paths and the formwork, which were given to the precast manufacturer. But rather than using a standard tile, again, we distorted that tile both in plan and section. And this did two things for us. One, when the tiles aggregated, it gave us a variable opening for the planting, but it also gave us a slope across those tiles that would direct the water into the planting and start to supplement the irrigation. So to actually derive the tile arrangement, we used Mies's book matching. And essentially what the book matching operation is that whenever you would cut a stone or a piece of wood, you would mirror it along one edge so that you would get grain matching, or this kind of pronounced figuration of the pattern across that surface. So that seemed really interesting to us with our particular interests. So one of the things that we needed to do, because we had a very restricted budget, is we wanted this maximum variation, but we needed to do it with a limited number of forms. So ultimately we came up with a system where we could use the book matching with 5 base tiles, and then there were 5 mirrored counterparts. So in the end we only had 10 pieces of formwork, and those produced the 192 tiles that would cover the surface of the plinth. So with this limited set of forms, we're able to get a high degree of variation with an equally high degree of efficiency. We also applied, you can see it, okay, it shows up better on the screen than it does on my monitor. We also used the same 4-foot spacing to organize the planting, but rather than the 4-foot spacing being orthogonal to the tiles themselves, we rotated that 45 degrees so that we would get a degree of variation and change of blooming and texture through those different openings. And here you can see the final installation shot from the upper level of the back wall. On the left there's the plinth after the tiles had just been installed, and then on the right, after the last couple of years that the planting had begun to establish. It was initially irrigated, but that irrigation has subsequently been turned off, and all the water happens through the surface itself. So the next 2 projects are 2 experimental gardens, the Not Garden and the Not Again Garden. They were completed last year at the beginning of summer 2009 and the end of the summer, basically late fall. We're in the first project. The material was rendered visible by unique shape and surface profile. In these gardens, we wanted to explore the potential for unseen surface substrate materials to clearly inform the articulated surface figures. So how we could use the subsurface retardant to actually produce a surface pattern. So we did this through a really simple material. It's called weed control barrier. And through the customization of the weed control barrier, we were able to get planting arrangements in the patterns that we had dictated, but you don't see them on the surface initially because the pattern's actually pre-cut for the growth openings. And it allowed us to use a material that is super cheap and very common. Geotextiles are used in commercial, residential, and infrastructural landscapes. And you could basically do it for about $1 or $2 a square foot. And given that our practice is located in Philadelphia, like most cities with a industrial heritage, it has an abundance of vacant land. I think Philadelphia has approximately 60,000 vacant lots presently. The city, however, has recently realized that these vacant lots are a potential resource. They started a program through federal funding through the Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, the NTI, with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, a program called the Clean and Green, or Green Philadelphia. And I think to date they've cleaned about 3,000 vacant lots in Philadelphia. And the basic procedure is simple. They find these vacant lots which have been actually returned to the city because the owners are no longer paying taxes on them. They go in and they remove all of the garbage and the existing vegetation. Sometimes they regrade the sites so that the water no longer runs off the site but runs back into the site. They basically throw down some seed for grass, plant a couple of trees, and then throw this cute little white picket fence around the perimeter of it. And so, you know, it's a really sensible strategy when you have thousands of acres of, you know, untaxable land. It makes a lot of sense. It's cheap. It's practical. But we were interested in how we could generate more variety or more visual richness in one of these vacant lots or a series of vacant lots. So we're asking ourselves the question, could we derive a vacant lot with a high level of visual richness, but with the same equally low cost method? And so to do that, we actually went back to the traditional knot garden, which we thought was pretty interesting. It has this, you know, super intricate geometric pattern, but they're also really heavily labor intensive and effort intensive. They actually take a lot of time to lay out the geometry. You have to manicure them and upkeep them all the time, and obviously that would just be the wrong precedent or the wrong application for this condition. So we're wondering, could we get the same intricate geometric patterns of the traditional knot gardens, but do so with a very low maintenance, low effort requirement that the Philadelphia Green program requires? So we thought, you know, it would be perfect to use this simple geotextile, which is basically a retardant for planting. And so we decided to do a couple of experimental test plots. And we found a organization in West Philadelphia where the University of Pennsylvania happens to be located near. It's called the Urban Tree Connection, and they have kind of a small but growing network of community gardens in the West Philadelphia area. And so they were nice enough to give us one of the plots that had been overrun by invasive vegetation and said, you know, have at it, do what you want. So they gave us this 400 square foot plot. And given that we hadn't done this before and we wanted to use a kind of test method, we divided that 400 square foot plot into two different sections. And we treated them a bit differently. But we needed to actually test the resolution and the resiliency of the fabric. So we just took a simple set of equally spaced circles, laid them out in a grid, and then we just changed their size and scale so that they moved from a simple freestanding figure into a figurated field, something similar to the traditional knot garden. And then after we had cut the textile in the school, we went out to the site and we cleaned it. In the test plot section 1, which is in the background of the upper left picture, we actually removed all of the existing invasive vegetation and brought in new soil. In the foreground site, we just surface cut the existing invasive vegetation and left that as is. So once we had cleaned the site, we came in and just laid the geotextile down on both of the sites. And then in the first test plot, we actually went back and seeded it with grass. And then after that, the seed had been laid down, we finished by covering both of the plots with gravel. And then you can see here in this slide, this is approximately 6-7 weeks of growth. You can see the various successes and failures that we got out of that test plot. The grass worked splendidly. It grew up in perfect resolution. It's held up really well to play and various cuttings, and it's still healthy and doing well this summer. Test plot 2 didn't do so well. Given the existing vegetation was broadleaf and creeping, ground cover, you could see, some idea of the circles in the foreground, but after a couple weeks, it basically became totally overgrown, and you couldn't tell that there was any pattern there. So, a little success and failure in that test plot. But given that we did have success in the first section, we decided to be a little more ambitious and do a larger garden. So the second garden, called Not Again, is an 1,800 square foot garden, also in West Philadelphia, and it's also in the same kind of garden community by the urban tree connection. And we actually approached the city of Philadelphia to have them lease us a piece of land for a year. It cost us all of $1 to lease this 1,800 square foot plot for 1 year. So we basically did the same method that we used for the knot garden. We went in, cleaned this site, cut the geotextile, and installed it and seeded it. But we did a little different pattern, with a little different strategy here for the patterning, because we were interested in getting a more kind of ornamental pattern, and also to get a richer diversity both of spaces, scalings, texture, and color. So instead of the scaling of the circle, we came up with a geometry which we finally figured out that would pack nicely. And when it packs, it actually produces secondary and tertiary figures. So we thought that was really interesting, that at times you would see the initial floral figure, but as these things started to pack, they would produce these other figures and then become also at times just an ornamental kind of floral field. We also treated this garden a little bit differently. We introduced clover into the seeding. That way we would get a variety of color through the summer season. It would have a kind of bloom period. It would change in texture. But the clover also provided an environmental benefit, because clover actually naturally produces nitrogen, which is necessary for healthy lawns. The clover also acts as a retardant to keep out other invasive plants. So it actually provided a dual role. So we got more of a surface benefit, but we also got this subsurface function of that being introduced into the field itself. Okay, so the last project that I'm just touching on this evening is called Ripple Effect. This was our first place entry into the HBBX Building Cultural Infrastructure Competition. It was an international ideas competition sponsored by the emerging New York Architecture Committee, which is part of the AIA chapter in New York. And like the prior two projects and most of the work that you'll see in the gallery itself, we again explored repetitive pattern as an organizational system to render stormwater processes visible. So in this surface technique, we're thinking of a way to use the kind of waste of stormwater, but turn it into an environmental and experiential resource. So how we could actually engage that and take this thing that's normally just discarded, a discarded pollutant, and actually make it part of the overall experience of the park itself. So the competition brief was fairly simple. It asked for a new art center located on the High Bridge Aqueduct or somewhere near it. It also asked the entrants to consider a reconfiguration of the bridge itself as a way to generate interest in reopening the now abandoned High Bridge Aqueduct. So they were really just asking for an art center somewhere located on or near the bridge and a way of rethinking the bridge as a connection from Manhattan to the Bronx. And the High Bridge itself, I'm not from New York, you're from New York, you probably know a lot about the High Bridge Aqueduct, but we were really excited when we did the research to find out that it was actually built as part of the 19th century Croton Aqueduct project, which was the first pipeline to bring water to New York City, given that New York had polluted all of its natural resources and had to start piping it from places far afield. So for this project, we were looking again at this kind of repetitive pattern. And so we actually derived this one, this kind of looping organization from the existing geometry of the bridge itself and the clover leaf of roadways below. And came up with what we called the infrabloom geometry. And these infrablooms were important for us because they were excellent shapes for water treatment. One, they would slow down the water would circulate through it and then move on to the next part of the infrabloom. But it also gave us a really interesting organization to intertwine the art, the recreation, and the landscape programs in interesting ways. So we really expanded the brief itself and went beyond thinking about the bridge and the art center and started to think about that aqueduct in its context and as a connected piece of infrastructure rather than an isolated piece of infrastructure. So using this infrabloom organization, we divided it basically into 3 different areas. What we called the intermittent, which was the landscape area in High Bridge Park in the Manhattan side. You see that on the left. The interstitial, which is the bridge itself spanning the Harlem River. And the internal, which is basically the art center that anchors the bridge on the Bronx side of the High Bridge Aqueduct. So the intermittent display was simply a network of paths, pools, puddles, and ponds. And they were meant to act as a water collection and cleansing system, but also sponsor and hold a series of diverse types of art and recreational activities. But one of their primary operation was to collect the rainfall. So they would collect the rainfall and the stormwater on the adjacent property that would actually move through the park. It would slowly filter through these different petals, and as it moved through, there would be a different kind of cleansing, and filtration. And then it would slowly move through the section of the park back towards the bridge. They were designed to be materially and topographically diverse. This way it would create a variable space and encourage different ways for artistic, recreational, and environmental exchanges to occur. It was also really interesting because of the variability in the rainfall. You could imagine that these spaces would always be changing, and the environment of the park would always be changing from day to day, week to week, but also when you'd move from the high point of the park down to the lower portions towards the bridge, because the water would slowly be moving from day one, say in the upper portion of the park, and would move down somewhere by day 4, or by a week, the water would start to appear in the lower portions of the park. So it would be interesting that one could go back to this park each day, each week, and it would always be a different event, a different environment of experience. This intermittent landscape was connected to the internal and the interstitial, which is actually on the bridge proper. You can see the internal display on the upper right part of the slide is what we designed as the art center to fulfill that part of the program brief. And that anchors the end of the bridge and connects the bridge to the upper section of the street. So using the same looping geometry, we actually configured the section of the building so it provided access down to the bridge and to the park and river on the Bronx side of the High Bridge Aqueduct. The interstitial display was actually the reconfiguration of the bridge itself. And we used the same petal-like geometry, but now the water that had moved through the park was actually running across the surface of the bridge itself and organized into a series of planting areas, splash puddles, and what we ultimately called these rain curtain petals. So as the water would move through the park, it would move across the surface of the bridge, and then it would fall through the interior of the bridge. And one could actually access the interior of that bridge and experience these rain curtains. So given that the aqueduct was now defunct and no longer used, we basically removed the existing 9-foot diameter pipe and made the interior of the bridge accessible. And this provided for an interesting way to simultaneously experience both an art event and a stormwater or rain event. They would be happening simultaneously. And then here is a kind of overview looking from the park side down to the Harlem River, back at the bridge and our art center at the end. And so after the water's kind of moved through the park and across the surface of the bridge, falls through it, you play with it. It actually reappears days later, maybe weeks later, depending on the process that it would take to move through all of these infrablooms, as an intermittent curtain of water falling from the bridge back to the Harlem River. But now, instead of it being kind of dirty storm water that spills solid waste in a kind of heavy rain events, it's now part of a cleaning mechanism for the Harlem River. So this rain delay, a temporal gap from storm event to bridge event, reinstates the presence of the river and a connection between the High Bridge Aqueduct and the Harlem River. That's it. Thank you.